And in this session, we wanted to focus on maybe a subset of countries that are facing the challenge of fragility. And perhaps if you're like me, I'm Rafat, I come from Yemen, I worked in government, but I also was working in NGOs as well before in Yemen. And sometimes a lot of the conversations that take place, you feel are not related too much to the context that we face in a lot of countries that are either in conflict or in very fragile situations. So we thought this session we would focus on fragility, and as it's titled, it's called Escaping the Fragility Trap. And that title comes from a commission that we led here at the Blavatnik School, which was called the LSE Oxford Commission on State Fragility, Growth and Development. And that was the report that came out of it in April, called Escaping the Fragility Trap. And it was an attempt to try and look at the current international approaches towards addressing fragility and to see whether they're working or not. And the evidence was that we are not seeing a good track record of success. And if they're not, what can be an alternative approach, and what should approaches, both from the international side, but also for governments in situations of fragility, how can they really address this situation? So we got a great panel today to try and unpack some of these challenges and what are the, let's call it, different approaches that can be taken. And we have, of course, Professor Serge Michailof, who I will introduce in more details when he speaks. We have Professor Paul Collier from the Blavatnik School of Government here, and we have Dr. Kathryn Nwajiaku, is that how you pronounce it? Okay, perfect. Who heads the Secretariat for the International Dialogue on Statebuilding and Peacebuilding at the OECD. So I'm just going to start with Paul, who will talk a little bit maybe about the main findings that we had from looking at fragility for almost a year, and frame it for us, and then we'll go to the discussions.
In fact, you will shut me up in 6 minutes.
Yes, yeah? I will try to keep everyone on time.
Yeah. The report is, you can download it for free, Escaping the Fragility Trap, right? It's a short report. It's very hard-hitting. It was meant to hit hard the pious bullshit which we think has festooned the desperately important topic of fragile states, and all that pious bullshit has led to failure repeatedly for a long time. So let me give you the two centerpieces of what I think of as pious bullshit. One is that if you look at some fragile state, there is some root cause, some particular injustice, which if only it's fixed, then things are all right. So you have to get to the root cause of some injustice, right? So that's the pious bullshit diagnosis of the problem. And then the solution is you get a vision of what the place will look like in 30 years' time. And the vision is always actually the same vision. In 30 years' time, Afghanistan will look something more or less like Denmark. Or Democratic Republic of the Congo will look something like Denmark, and then you say, so here's the future, Denmark, and here it is at the moment. What's the difference? That's the menu for action. All right. So your menus for action are address the root cause injustice, and then set about the menu of what's the difference between Afghanistan now and Denmark, and then off we go. That's what we've got to change. Why is all that pious bullshit so disastrous? So one central proposition of the Fragile States Report is that fragility is a syndrome of characteristics. It doesn't really matter how you got into that syndrome, but once you're in a syndrome of these characteristics, you're trapped into it. And the syndrome is made up of a number of different characteristics, about half a dozen of them. Low state legitimacy with a group of its own citizens. Never mind whether it's recognized internationally, but if it doesn't have legitimacy with a group of its own citizens, that's a problem. it doesn't have much state capacity to do things. Because it doesn't have much state capacity, then you don't have much tax revenue, you don't have much security, you don't have all the things that a state needs to do in order to get legitimacy. Because it's not got much security and not much infrastructure, you don't have much of a private sector, proper firms, and so people are poor and unproductive. Because the place is poor, unproductive, it's shock prone. It's shock prone both politically and economically. And so even if you start to improve, you hit some shock and you go back. It's a snakes and ladders thing. So it's a syndrome that traps the society. And it's hard to break out of that. And breaking out has to adopt strategies which respect all the constraints. In particular, it has to respect the constraint you haven't got much state capacity. And so if you benchmark against Denmark and say, here's what's different with Denmark, and then you get on, you say, here's the 1,000 things you need to do, you immediately doom yourself to failure because you massively overload the capacity of the state to do things. So our strategy is step-by-step short-term wins, whilst in the medium term trying to build a more effective state and a state that actually manages to win the willing compliance of its citizens by greater trust with citizens. So let me close with sort of one concept, which I think is quite useful, and that's the concept of scaffolding. Suppose you want to end up with a tall building. Right? How do you build that tall building? You put up scaffolding. Once you've built the tall building, you can take the scaffolding down, right? And the building will be stable. You've got from one initial equilibrium where you didn't have the tall building to a new one where you do, right? But if you just study the completed tall building and say, that's what we need to do, that's Denmark, you learn nothing about what's required to make the transition. In other words, the completed building, once it's a stable new equilibrium, doesn't need the scaffolding, you take it down. But the essence of transition out of fragile states is understanding the necessary scaffolding to get you out of a stable but dysfunctional equilibrium. And we've not studied the scaffolding, we've studied Denmark. Right?
Thanks, Paul. Great introduction and a great precedence for sticking to time. So I'll head it to Serge, and Serge, we're lucky because you're bringing not only a lot of analysis and understanding of fragility, but also a lot of concrete on-the-ground experience, as you did work with the World Bank, and you were running their country office in Democratic Republic of Congo, but you also headed the French aid agency, AFD, and your latest book, which I see you have a copy of, is called Africanistan, which, as I understand, compares your experience as a senior advisor in Afghanistan for many years with what the realities in Africa is. And I think it would be great to hear from you where you think the focus should be there.
Thank you very much. To tell you frankly, among the myriad of problems affecting fragile countries, which Paul told you about, there is one which is very critical. It's the matter of security. If you have some servers, people living in a highly insecure area, such as around the Lake Chad today, their main concern, beyond immediate food access or shelter, etc., is security, because they are very much afraid of being killed or slaughtered at night with their families by some unknown people, etc. So restoring security in this type of countries is very problematic. And for decades, donors have said that there is no development without security, no security without development. But in terms of support to security, they have done very, very little. So basically, they have relied upon foreign forces, which in an emergency may be a necessary step. This is what occurred in Mali in 2013 when Operation Serval, blocked the jihadist threat on Bamako. The problem is that due to a clash of culture and many other reasons, you cannot expect lasting long-term security provided by foreign troops, simply because they are perceived very quickly as an occupation force. This was true in Afghanistan, where I saw in Kabul, in 2002, just after the American victory, people cheering, US patrols walking in the streets of Kabul. But 3 years later, they were spitting on their path. French soldiers in 2013 have been cheered by people, but now they are pelted with stones. So basically, one key lesson, the first lesson, is that foreign forces cannot restore security in this type of context. Second, there is another type of force which is supposed to provide security. It's the UN-led peacekeeping forces. The problem, they look very impressive with their armored equipment. But the problem, they look like an army, but they are not an army. Their rules of engagement, their capacity, the fact that, even in Mali, you have about 29 different countries involved in the MINUSMA, makes them a very poor fighting force. And in fact, if you look at Mali, they cost about $1 billion a year, and they have lost 160 men in 3 years. And their main concern is not to provide security to the people, is to provide their own security. Basically, if you have a political agreement, they can, of course, help, police the country and help smooth out things. But if there is no peace agreement, they cannot fight to impose peace. This is sometimes impossible, up to a point that people resent that and they become almost irrelevant. So I guess that maybe it's time to assess the cost-benefit ratio of this type of intervention, and to try to find alternative UN approaches to this type of situation. Because it costs a lot, and maybe with this money we could do better. Now, I have some problem with the security. Yeah. Now, the problem is you cannot rely upon, yes, that's okay. If you cannot rely upon foreign forces, and if you cannot rely upon the UN forces, basically you are back to local or regional forces. The problem is that they are generally in very poor shape, and they badly need major reform, huge reforms. Huge reforms because, really, I'm having some trouble with this stuff. Maybe I can, yeah.
This is why I never use technology.
Okay. You're very wise. Because reforming these forces require a lot of efforts, particularly to reform their governance, because the way they are governed sometimes it's a critical and problematic issue. And I think I'm going to ask for some new setup. Because if you look at the Malian army, at the composition of the Malian army, because the Malian army has received a lot of training of technical assistance, of support, some weaponry also. But look at the composition of the Malian army. Do they need an artillery battalion which will never be present where the fight occurs? You have many cases like that. And is the Malian army of the right size? Is it the right composition of troops? So the problem is that most of these armies, but this is also true for the police, for the gendarmerie, etc., have been built on a clientelist system, which means that you could become a general, you could become a high officer if you were well connected to powerful people, not because you were good, not even because you were lucky, just as Napoleon was used to say. So it's very important to try to reform these institutions, not only to provide technical assistance training, because technical assistance training will not solve the basic issue, which is basically a political problem, which is clientelism. Now, if the problem that suppose you want to reform thoroughly your army and your forces, etc., when you're confronted to countries such as Niger or Mali, and both these countries have basically 2.5 times the size of France. They have huge territories, but they have no resources. And it's very difficult to assess the cost of security in this type of country because they are afraid of the IMF. They hide a lot of the security expenditure under the carpet. And the IMF never wants to really look below the carpet. So even, I was surprised to see the Minister of Finance in Niger asking me, how could you help me to find out how much costs security in my country? So I went digging into the statistics using also a very, very good document prepared by the World Bank. That was a unique, almost unique document, a PR expenditure for a security sector. And I found that the level of security expenditure was in the range of 6.3% of GDP. When you know that the army expenditure in France is about 1.7% of GDP, and when you also know that the tax to GDP ratio in Niger is 17%, in France is 45–50%, you understand very clearly that these countries do not have the resources to meet the security challenge to which they are confronted. So it leads them to a budget on security impasse, because each time they have a security emergency, they cut on development expenditure and they cut on social expenditure. So it's really a nonsense. Now, the problem is that if you want to build a really efficient security apparatus, it takes money, it takes time, and generally there is plenty of money for these countries now. That was not the case 15 years ago. But you have no specific pocket, no specific budget to be able to fund local security expenditures. For instance, in Afghanistan, in some years, the amount of foreign development aid was in the range of 50% of GDP. You see the results. But until 2008, there was no resource, no significant resource to fund the local army. Because the USAID was there to fight poverty, not to fight the Taliban. And the US Army was killing bad boys. That was the expression. But to fund the Afghan army, there was no resources, which means that basically the design of the Afghan army was made on the basis of expectation of budget capacity of the Afghan economy once the US Army would have killed all the Taliban, which was fairly accurate. In fact, they consider that Afghanistan could afford maybe about 30,000 soldiers, but certainly no more. The problem is that when General Petraeus arrived in 2008, was the leader in terms of a counter-emergency activity. He scratched his head. He said, the size of the Afghan army should at least, Afghan army plus police, should at least be 350,000 people. A best option would be 600,000 people. And when you look at the Algerian Civil War, 1992–1993, Algeria was approximately the same size and same population as Afghanistan. And the Algerian army went up to 550,000 people, so it was not totally crazy. So the problem, nobody wanted to fund the Afghan army, so the result was that until very late in the process, because it was necessary to find resources to fund the army, to get the budgets approved, to recruit the soldiers, to recruit and to train the officers. It was not before 2011 that basically some kind of Afghan army was reasonably structured. But I can say that today it's not up to the job, still not up to the jobs. And when you look at the police force a little bit, this policeman here is securing not a field of roses, you can imagine. It looks like roses, but that's poppy. The problem with the police is that they got the same kind of support from the international community as the Malian army is getting today, which means the training, technical assistance. You send people for training in France and Germany, in the US, etc. You provide some equipment, but you don't clean the upper hierarchy, which has been put there as part of clientelist system. And because you do not clean the top hierarchy, the police was a mafia, and now it's a much better equipped, better trained mafia, but it's still a mafia. So sorry, I have some real problem. Yeah. So in such context, somebody has to pay for security in this type of context. Basically, maybe I should.
Should we point it out?
Yeah.
Where do we point that?
Here. Okay. And the donors community should fund, in my view, some of the security expenditure, but they still resist very strongly to this idea. Whoop. The problem is that if you look at Sahel today, Sahel is basically the size of Western Union, Western Africa, Western Europe. And security in such a wide expanse should be considered as a regional public good. And as such, it should be, funded by the beneficiaries. And the main beneficiary is Europe, because if you don't secure Sahel, you will get terrorism, you will get massive migration, etc., etc. So it's a critical issue. The problem, when you see that the G5 regional force, which was recently created, cannot get significant funding from EU, it means that European countries have not been able to understand the magnitude of the challenge today. Basically, it's Saudi Arabia which is funding most of the G5 operation, which means that we ask what we call in French the pompier pyromane, the fireman who puts fire, whom we ask to fund that. So I'm getting a bit upset by that stuff. It must be, yeah, okay. So the donors don't want to fund security, but in fact, they provide, budget support. And by providing budget support due to the fungibility of resources, they fund security expenditure already. And in the past, I was speaking about Algeria, just a few minutes ago. In 1993, when Algeria had some trouble to fund its security expenditure, moving from an army of 100,000 to 500,000, what did they do? They went to the IMF, and the IMF said, "Okay, you have a budget crisis, so we will provide you with some help, and you will, thanks to the IMF program, you will get a cancellation of debt, etc." So basically, the IMF, was the major funder of the Algerian war effort against the jihadists in 1993. They seem to have forgotten that today. The problem, of course, is that, donors control more or less most budgets in fragile countries because they are providing funding for these different sectors, agriculture, infrastructure, energy, etc. But they turn a blind eye to security. They don't want to hear about that. So as a result, most of the corruption, most of the mismanagement in terms of procurement goes into the security sector. And by doing so, even though they indirectly fund the security sector, the major, mismanagement corruption occurs precisely in the security sector. So my recommendation, I made this recommendation to the bank executive director recently, is that the World Bank should prepare public expenditure reviews of security sectors in these areas. Very standard system. This would be much helpful. One was prepared for Afghanistan in the early 2000s. Another has been prepared in Niger in 2013, and that was a great use for me when I dig. And in addition, someone, I think the UN or concerned bilateral, should help put some order in the mess which is represented by security expenditure. When you see anything, socks costing $200, things, socks for the military for $200. It is absolutely incredible. So basically, I'm not good at technology. The problem is that funding security raises a lot of challenging questions, ethical questions. And I wouldn't recommend for the international community funding, for instance, Kabila's army today. He has no legitimacy. We know how he behaves, etc., with population. So you need to have some kind of, I would call, mutually agreed long-term commitment between the international community and a fragile country which would accept this type of funding and support. And basically, you need to have political conditionalities. It doesn't mean that elections, as they are presently organized, provide the necessary legitimacy. So maybe Paul will comment on that. But you also need to be very requiring in terms of human rights. You know, if you fund a police force which behaves just as this gentleman on these slides, this is just unacceptable. So you need to have a number of conditionalities. You need to have what I would call also transparency in procurement and human resource management, which is not based on clientelism but on performance. So basically you hire rationalization of expenditure, merit-based. And now I come to a few last slides. The problem is that it's not because you are going to rebuild the army and the gendarmerie or the police force that you are providing security to your country. Because suppose you have a rehabilitated army, which is not the case today of the Malian army, but the army, suppose it cleans a district, it will not stay there for years to provide day-to-day security. It will have to move somewhere else. And if you do not have a proper government able to move in, providing, you know, the gendarmerie, the police, the local administration, but also the public services, health, education, etc., basically the lacking system will be substituted by, you know, parallel structure. And here you see the parallel structure inside with Iyad Al-Ghali, the head of the jihadists in Israel, who is a very clever guy. They will substitute, and they are presently in the center of Mali, substituting their own political or military structure to what? To absent, because people fear insecurity, to absent inefficient, corrupt local officials. So the main lesson is that unless you reconstruct the core state institutions in this type of situation, you will never be able to provide long-term security, which means that this is a very difficult task, but which can, I'm sure, be done, because I've seen a number of successful experiences. It's a problem. Yeah. Because, you know, many experts tell you that it requires a generation to change, you know, to make a dysfunctional state into a functional state. But from what I have seen in many cases, if you take individual institutions, you can transform completely institution in 6 months to 3 years' time. We had earlier this morning a description of what was possible in the what I understand is the municipal system of Kampala. Well, in a few months, you can completely overhaul. You need to have the political courage to fire a number of people, to recruit people on a different basis. But basically, it's feasible. I've seen this done at the level of a few institutions in Afghanistan. I've seen that and participated into the process in DRC and in other countries. It's possible technically. Financially, it's not so expensive. The problem is political. Because if you want to move from a clientelist system to a merit-based system, it's a huge shock. Because the political economy, this is just the end of my presentation, the political economy is not ready for that. Because you are cutting a number of rents which these institutions, misgoverned institutions, were providing to the party in power, to the president. And because you are also limiting the power and the authority of the president to appoint whomever he wants at the position he wants. So it's a big jump that you can expect to make if you have support from the president, and if you are not overly ambitious. You can do that for 5, 6 key institutions, but certainly not for the entire government. So that's basically one of the messages I'm bringing in this book with a provocative title, but which is more serious than the title.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I see your very concrete recommendation to the World Bank. So I'm going to call on, we're lucky to have Shanta here, who's the acting chief economist at the World Bank, to maybe respond after Kathryn on where the World Bank sees these security expenditures. But we'll go with Kathryn, who's done a lot of work on fragility in different capacities, latest of which as head of Secretariat, as I mentioned, for the International Dialogue for Statebuilding and Peacebuilding at the OECD. And before that, you've been working on the state of fragility reports that the OECD were publishing. So maybe if you let us know where the international dialogue is, where the latest is from the OECD on approaching fragility.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, yeah, it's great that I'm coming after Paul and Serge, because what I have to say is, in many ways, in response to first of all, Paul's comment about PBS, pious BS, and Serge's comment about, or his whole presentation about the importance of security. So I'm from the International Dialogue on Peacebuilding and Statebuilding. It's an OECD-hosted partnership between OECD, DAC, Development Assistance Committee countries, and 20 countries called the G7+. It's a group of countries that came together over the last 10 years to create a sustained dialogue with donors about what kind of support they required to get themselves beyond fragility. And it also contains a civil society platform of actors from OECD countries and G7+ countries that are also part of this dialogue. And interestingly, just in response to Paul's comment that a lot of the pious bullshit hasn't really taken us very far, I'd like to suggest that beyond pious, what we in the dialogue were trying to do 10 years ago when we developed something called the New Deal for engagement in fragile states, was to try and go beyond pious pronouncements, but to secure commitments across those dialogue members about what was required really to get countries out of this mess. That's by way of introduction, but I just want to perhaps begin. Sorry, I want to stand up because I feel a bit cramped. I just want to start by just perhaps situating this within what we've heard over the last day and a half now. I mean, one of the main themes of this conference was really about technology and data and how we can use such to help us get more efficient government. And listening to a lot of the interventions, I kept on, obviously everyone's got their reference in the back of their minds, and I was thinking, okay, so how does this apply to fragile context, how does this apply to... I constantly had to do this, adjust your television sets when we think about how this applies, because we are talking in the main about countries that are very new, recent formations, where statehood and public service are very unstable configurations. And something that was also in the back of my mind when I was listening to the conversations was also about the place of politics. So I was very glad to hear Serge's recommendations at the end, that we take the politics of these institutions very seriously and move ourselves beyond perhaps a technocratic understanding of what needs to be done. So yeah, that's really that last point there. Because I'm coming from the OECD, I have to say something about what the OECD says about fragility. As I said, I manage a partnership between OECD countries and others. And the OECD bit of that partnership does produce once every 2 years now a report called the States of Fragility Report. And what it's been running for about 8 years now. And what it tries to do is essentially look at flows, essentially ODA flows, development assistance flows to fragile contexts. And say, it was initially set up as an instrument to try and say we need to do more. But it's become more, it's developed into kind of a thematic state of play report about where we are on fragility. And I just wanted to perhaps just take us back a few steps and give us a sense of what how the OECD understands fragility. So initially it was combining a number of lists used by the bank and others to try and, look at, to have a group of countries that it would evaluate, what flows are looking like. In the last couple of years, it's moved towards a much more what they call a multidimensional take on fragility. So they're looking at different dimensions of fragility in the sense that it's not just a group of fragile countries, but looking at kind of trends and sort of measures of fragility and exposure to risk. So self-explanatory there, fragility can lead to negative breakdowns. It's become a much more kind of complexified sort of definition of what we're talking about. And so they just produced a report out a few months ago that describes where donors are at on this issue. I won't say too much about that. I'll put up a slide which summarises the report in a minute, but I just wanted to come back to share with you some of the conversations around this report, the Escaping Fragility report, within the OECD and within the dialogue. So Paul insists upon the importance of moving beyond the piousness and focusing on what countries really need and getting them out of a syndrome rather than looking to root causes. And the OECD, in its new definitions, is very much moving back into a root causes of fragility frame. And so, it's suggesting there are big tensions in terms of, who's right on this. And I think the OECD, in borrowing from what's been happening within the bank and the Pathways for Peace report and a number of other publications, is very much looking at grievance issues and societal sort of contestation. It's not just the mechanics of government, it's not just the functioning or the lack of such in terms of state capacity, but it's about what sort of state and looking at fragility as the result of states that are perceived as illegitimate and that are contested. So that debate isn't yet resolved by any stretch of the imagination. And I think, so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking of Paul's Escaping Fragility trap as a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy approach to fragility, which we can fix this, and it's a question of moving out of a trap, versus this kind of OECD, it's these dimensions, and we have to look at, these fundamental causes. So back to us in the dialogue. So the dialogue is trying to bring together this G7+ group, INCAF members, the International Network on Conflict and Fragility. It's a subset of the DAC in the OECD, and a civil society platform. And we say, essentially, in bringing together, in developing the New Deal in 2011, that it might be a combination of both. So rather than presuming that we don't look at root causes, yes, we do have to look at root causes or drivers, and we describe these in a very similar way to the OECD's definition now. But we also say that the basics in terms of improving state capacity are really important. And I think that stands. We can start to unpack why and how the New Deal has actually been translated into practice. It was, a classic best practice frame, and which the members of the international dialogue were supposed to put into practice. And I would very much agree with Paul and Serge that it has been a lot of nice words. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to say, for those of you who are not familiar with this New Deal framework, essentially had 3 bits. The first was about where we believed the focus of international engagement should be. So it was kind of critique of what many G7 plus countries had seen as, when you're fragile, you'd have a kind of menu, not that you choose, but you're kind of given humanitarian, if you're lucky, humanitarian assistance, or parallel structures through which that is channeled. And instead of helping you out of your fragile situation towards something more resilient, that creates even bigger challenges in terms of your predicament. So the peacebuilding and state-building goals were part of a way of these 3 constituencies coming together to say, okay, even in immediate post-conflict situations or in deep fragility, we still need to be focusing on these things. And just as Serge highlighted, legitimate politics and inclusive settlements, security, justice, building economic foundations, and building the capacity of states to actually raise their own revenue and services. So it's a kind of a mixing together of a number of things. And we also have these other 2 pillars, which are, and I'll just focus on the last one, the green one, which is really about, what it was part of the aid effectiveness or development effectiveness agenda, I suppose, and saying that in fragile environments as well, it was important to also use aid modalities that allowed them to get themselves out of a fragile situation. Aid modalities which would actually allow them to strengthen state capacity and so on. So transparency, managing and sharing risk, using and strengthening country systems, building capacity and so on. So where are we now? It's been almost 10 years since the international dialogue came together. I have been heading the Secretariat for the last 5 years, and I'd like to speak here kind of my own personal reflections after that time. I think the principles of the New Deal, which now we're calling the principles rather than a framework or package, I think still are valid in terms of describing what is required in these contexts. Implementing is another story entirely, and I think what we sometimes lose sight of in these conversations is how the political climate in those would-be scaffold builders has changed quite dramatically. So whereas when the New Deal was created, we were on an upspin, sort of a progressive upspin, where we felt that it was possible to think and act politically and have another kind of offer with respect to fragile environments. I think now there's been a lot of backpedaling and a much more conservative, risk-averse donor community that is less believing in the idea of rebuilding state capacity in order to. There's a breakdown of trust in the underlying commitments that the New Deal was about. So we're in a different political space within the multilateral system. That's very clear. And so the scope for doing this kind of New Deal has reduced, even though the needs, I believe, in terms of the security that Serge very eloquently outlined, are really stark and clear. So just one figure. I flicked through the OECD's Statebuilding report, and it does cite, that in terms of security, it's very complicated because of the issues around whether development assistance can be actually used for security spending. It's another story. But in terms of those PSGs, those peacebuilding and state-building goals, those good things that you ought to be investing in, they, in terms of DAC statistics, what's being funded on that is in the range of 2 to 4.5% or something. Even the way the DAC actually counts and codes expenditure on those issues is the subject of a lot of debate. But even notwithstanding that debate, we're really, really low down. So the New Deal in my view, and I've said this in other fora, I don't believe that we've sufficiently tried it out, let alone be in a position to say that it hasn't really worked. There's definitely a politics that hasn't been in its favour. So what we've seen is a kind of cherry picking around certain elements of the New Deal, and that has its own problems. I want to end in recognition of Nairi's plea that we think for the positive, towards the positive, and not just the problems and so on. I do think what I really like about the Escaping Fragility report is its plea for pragmatism. And I think we need to combine that plea for pragmatism, which I do think is the right way to go, with a kind of openness to innovation. And I think I say that given the space that I'm standing in and what we've been hearing over the last few days. I attended a very interesting panel, a set of panels yesterday about, just looking at, different innovations in terms of data and tech. That we're not talking about fragile context, but I think we could usefully think of how we could apply them. I just want to finish by just drawing up this. It's in terms of innovation. You may recall when I put up that New Deal chart, there was one priority which is supposed to be about building economic foundations. And one of the things that I've been very interested in the last couple of years has been working with the private sector, working with asset managers and institutional investors, BNP Paribas notably. And admittedly, it's their responsible business sort of impact arm. It's not the bank side, it's the asset management side. Working with them to try and construe, what an offer for investors could look like with respect to fragile environments. So typically, the countries that we deal with are kind of no-go or red marked already. So when investors consider them, it's really on a kind of exclusion basis because of lack of real knowledge, lack of discernment about the variation across and so on. So we've been engaged in a conversation through BNP Paribas with a number of responsible investors to try and work out what kind of financial instruments they could use to kind of consider certain types of fragile situation as possible. It's the beginning of a conversation. And we've developed a series of reports that we're going to publish, which is kind of looking at things like social bonds as an instrument, looking at possible certification to ensure that where there are investments, they actually are peace promoting and so on. And there's the whole community of actors working in this space, which suggests that it is possible, beyond the New Deal frame, to start to see how innovations could possibly be brought to bear in fragile contexts in ways that move us beyond the present state. So on that, I think I did pretty well, didn't I, in terms of time? So I think I'd like to finish. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for all the panelists. I think gave us a real good flavor of what the conversations are in this field. I'd like to take a few Q&As and then I'll come back still to Shanta. And where do we have the mic? Okay. So I'll take one next to Shanta, then we'll come here. The blue shirt. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. This question goes for anyone who would like to take it. In many parts of the world where especially countries that have been facing a very complicated security issues, there's been a lot of debate on how should we tackle and what is the strategy to be followed. And in that sense, a lot of politicians tend to always focus that the lack of socioeconomic opportunities has as a direct result the problem of opportunity. But then they start to just focus in the debate on this kind of like indirect policies that would lead us to this utopia in 20 years. So my concise question would be is, when we're talking about facing problems of violence and insecurity, where do you see or what are the main challenges that should be tackled, at least in the short, in the middle, and in the long run?
Thank you. Here, please.
First, thank you for your outstanding presentations. My question is, in escaping fragility, how do we address the education security dilemma? And I'm asking this because I come from Colombia, a country that for more than 70 years have suffered from terrorism. Two groups have been killing, raping, child recruiting, and we always, on the national budget debate at Congress, there is always the dilemma if money should go more to education or to security. And so I would like your how to address that dilemma in escaping fragility. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you have in the back there? Yeah.
So one of the recommendations of the Fragility Commission was that reducing aid dependency for fragile countries should be explicitly recognized as premature. I cannot agree more on that. My question is how difficult it is to get political consensus on this, considering the Donald Trumps and the IMFs of this world.
Thank you. And the lady in front? Yeah, just there. And sorry, I'm sure we're not going to have time for all the questions because I see a timer on our screen, but let's take a couple more.
The panel's remarks today is making me wonder to what extent short-termism in decision-making is contributing to fragility trap. And if so, how do we even begin balancing pragmatism and perhaps a touch of idealism in actually building our way towards making more sustainable decisions by governments as well as policymakers?
Thank you. We'll take a couple in the back, and then I'll shift my side to this side, I promise.
Thank you. Is this idea of leaving security to the donors' funding practicable in the first instance, when security being one of the most sensitive and fundamental functions of any given state, can't be left to the donor funding, which is like unpredictable and which keeps changing given that ever-changing international political environment. And it seems to be inconsistent with your own findings that you showed that U.S. or French forces, for that matter, wherever they intervened in the first place to address the security needs of a given state, those attempts were not successful, and I don't see much difference. There could be a difference superficially between the donors funding and the countries that, like US or France, which, interjected to address the security needs. There could be a difference in approach superficially, but I can't see much difference in underlying approaches on a given subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take one from this side? The lady here. The lady there.
I'm going to turn Kathryn's question to me yesterday back to her today a little bit. I suspect that when we talk about technology and we talk about fragility, that your residents' biggest problems in fragile states are not whether scooters can ride on sidewalks or on streets, but that there are just different pressing issues that they're facing. And are the tech solutions, particularly in the civic space, ever going to meet the needs of communities that you're working with? Or do we need to have a separate ecosystem that's focused on tech and interventions that are designed for inclusivity, but particularly with an eye towards fragility?
Thanks. And I'll give Shanta a minute to just respond to this. I see the timer is already at 3 minutes. But Shanta, how does the World Bank see the whole funding security?
I thought I was going to talk about the security public expenditure review that Serge mentioned. I have lots of questions for the panel, but I'll leave that aside. The World Bank does public expenditure reviews, has been doing them for 30 years, of the whole budget. Now, what's interesting is that in many countries, we could do the whole budget except for the security sector. I remember once doing a PER of Jordan, and they said, the military and the royal court is the only two things you cannot touch. That was 50% of the budget. Now, we have since realized that this is increasingly important, but I think there are 2 or 3 real problems in doing a security public expenditure review that we have to be aware of. I mean, they can be resolved. One is when we do a public expenditure review, we are also making a judgment as to whether expenditure is too much or too little in education or health or transport and things like that. Now, when you get to security, that's an assessment of the threat that the country is facing. And I'm not sure we have the competence or even the mandate to make a judgment on that. So at one level, that public expenditure, that security expenditure review has to be very circumspect about the threat that the country is facing. The second is we also, in many cases, lack the expertise to judge whether the expenditure is efficient or not. Now, in the case of Niger that Serge was describing, it so happened that the manager in charge of the report was a former member of the French military. So he had the expertise. But you know, this is a sort of separate kind of expertise from what we economists. And the third, and this is something I'm grappling with, is we also insist on making all of our public expenditure reviews public. Well, this kind of information, if we dig really deep to find out how much Niger is spending on security, that's of great interest to a lot of people who you don't want to inform, or you want to share that information. So there has to be some kind of protocol as to whether we put this in the public domain or not. But given all of that, I fully agree. This is incredibly important. And certainly, if a country asks us to do it, we have to respond in one way or the other. There's also the question of the countries that don't ask us to do it, where we still probably should be doing it.
Great. Thanks a lot, Chant. And
Yes,
yes, so in a minute, if each of you could address one of the questions at least that were thrown back, because we are running out of time.
Okay. Just maybe answering Chantal's. You know, I think the World Bank cannot do that alone. That's why also I mentioned the fact that you need the support of the UN or some concerned bilateral. In fact, the UN has a lot of military expertise because they are managing 100,000 people all throughout the world, you know. So you have a number of generals and high officials. Maybe they are not the best in the world, but at least you have a lot of expertise. So you could rely on this expertise, you know. And regarding making public this information, there's no reason to make it public. You know, there are areas which, of course, can remain, you know, out of the public domain, particularly because otherwise you are going to provide very interesting information to your enemies. So I think you can say that, okay, we'll do that for our discussion with the government, but in no way this should be made public. This is not a poverty assessment. It's much deeper. I'm sorry.
Paul?
Yeah, I just wanted to give 3 quick examples of pious bullshit. One is, if everything matters, root causes and syndrome, nothing matters. You've got to make your mind up, focus, right? It's a basic proposition. If everything matters, nothing matters, right? These are situations where they're highly constrained. You really need the donors to learn to prioritize, to focus on a few damn things, right? We've got 15, 20 years of accumulated failure because we've had this gulf between the rhetoric which says everything, you know, the rhetoric is meant to offend nobody, and then the reality of actions is its short-termist ineffectiveness, whatever a donor fancies. The elections, Serge raised this, so this is more pious bullshit that the way to get a legitimate government is exactly the way we do it in Denmark. You hold an election. Well, guess what? It doesn't work in a society which is fragmented, where a lot of the population doesn't see government as legitimate. Libya held an election, right? You know, if they all hold elections, it doesn't produce legitimate government. The big disaster recently was Zimbabwe, where at last tanks are used to get rid of the old dictator, Mugabe, and then it's obvious what you have to have, which is power sharing for a couple of years. And instead, the international community insists on elections. What that does is perpetuate the division. And now we've got a government which sort of won a sort of election, right? Whatever did they expect, right? My final example is carbon emissions, right? I've just 2 days ago with lunch with a firm that's trying to establish palm oil in Liberia. Palm oil is native to West Africa, right? Coastal West Africa. It's the perfect thing to grow. They could generate 14,000 jobs growing palm oil, right? What's their biggest impediment? The NGOs that are saying, oh, this would increase carbon emissions. I mean, it doesn't matter one damn how much carbon Liberia emits, right? Not one damn. Think of it, right? This is a fragile state that could go back into murderous conflict, and it desperately needs jobs that people can do. And the disgrace that NGOs think, posture as pious good people who are restraining bad people who want to emit carbon, when actually what they're doing is perpetuating fragility in these places. That is shameful, and they need to be called out. I've just done it.
Kathryn.
I just have a few words on the idealism versus pragmatism question and link it to the tech question. I mean, I think interestingly, before coming here, I was talking to my G7 plus colleagues about, okay, so what do you want me to say on this thing? And it's exactly what they said. He was saying, you know, you're talking about the basic premises of the report as not just well-meaning, but sound. However, still wanting to reach for the stars. Because, and I link this to the technocratic question not the technocratic question, the tech question, really about, you know, is it possible, even in fragile environments, to imagine that solutions that have necessarily been carved, recent ones, I mean, I'm talking about the Denmark example, but solutions that are emerging in the context of conversations about more efficient governments elsewhere could have applicability. And my sense is that it's worth a try. And I think I'm very inspired by what I heard from Uganda this morning in terms of allowing oneself to dare to think that in these fragile environments, which are very diverse, the best is also possible. And I'd like to finish there, I think.
Thanks for ending it in a positive note that we are allowed to dare, that things are possible. And I hope this gave us at least enough food for thought to do it while we have actual food. I think we have lunch break now. But thanks for everyone for attending, and thanks for the panelists, and we'll give them a final round.